Volgens mij kun je gewoon rustig zitten totdat de commissie komt hoor.
Is the sound full?
Yes, it seems that put one there for everyone.
Yes. Just in case they put this one for me.
Yeah.
Because I have.
Yes, you have your own copy. Right? So. So, if you like to sit for a couple minutes, you can. Bill will come and tell us when to stand up again when everyone else does. Oh, they even provide a glass of water.
Yes.
I wondered about that. I thought maybe, what if you need to drink? Oh, they can stand now.
Madam Candidate, this committee has been appointed by the board for the award of the doctorate and will examine you on your dissertation and its propositions. The discussion will be opened by Professor Ingelbien of the Catholic University of Louvain. It's my privilege and my honor to welcome him here, to thank him for his willingness to participate in this ceremony, and I gladly give him the floor.
Madam Candidate,
Yes.
it's been a pleasure for me to read your thesis. One of the great strengths of your thesis is the way you bring Madame de Staël's career to bear on what is otherwise a very English dialogue between English women poets. But you also seem to argue that those English writers managed to draw out what you call the significance of Staël's career. And you even say on page 32, for instance, that last paragraph, you argue that Landon sets aside the surface storyline of Staël's original novel, A Woman's Unrequited Love, and that she highlights what is signified by it. I'm rather puzzled by your use there of words like surface and significance. You seem to imply that the English poets managed to see what is real about the story of Corinne by peering beneath a superficial Leia, which is the love plot of Corinne. Now, my sense is that those English poets actually read their own concerns with English domesticity into aspects of Corinne's story where domesticity is not actually central. I get a sense when I read Corinne by Madame de Staël that Corinne's relation to her audience, her Italian audience in particular, is not really the problem. It's really her relation to Lord Nelville which is the problem. So isn't it in fact the case that Staël's English readers, Landon, Hemans and others, actually misread Staël when they appropriate her? And to what extent do you think that culturally determined misreadings occur in intertextual dialogues between women writers of different nations and different cultures?
There, hello, the opponents. Thank you for your question. If I understand your question correctly, you are asking about British women poetry's misreading about Corinne's stories. But I would say that they correctly captured the essence of Corinne's story. And I think that the original story of Corinne shows some discrepancies between the Corinne, the poet of Rome, Corinne, and her audience, including the Italian audience and the British audience. So I think that when, for instance, when Corinne was singing before the public at Napoli, the audience there felt really glad about Corinne's poems, but still they felt that they would be happy if their songs had been would have had more merry tunes. So I think in this sense, Corinne felt some distance and discrepancy between herself and the Napolitan audience. So the similar thing happened in the case when Corinne was singing performing before the English public. At that time, English audience were, of course, gladdened by Corinne's beautiful songs, but still they felt that Corinne's songs were really sorrowful, and they were really happy about that. But it does mean that they were happy about the sorrowful tunes, and at the same time, what it means is that they are indifferent to Corinne's inner suffering. So in this sense, English audience had some distance from Corinne. So I do think that in both cases, in the case of Italian audience and in the case of British audience, in both these cases, I think that Corinne had a discrepancy between the poet and the audience. So I think London and Hemans understood this situation. So I think in this sense they captured the essence of Corinne's suffering in the original novel.
Thank you. The discussion will be continued by Professor Toll.
Madam Candidate, I should like to congratulate you. Am I to be understood? Can you hear me?
Yes.
I should like to congratulate you not just on the completion of your PhD thesis, but on producing one that is well presented and accurate, even to the extent of your having sent on an errata slip. The degree of accuracy is remarkable. I have found only a small handful of typos, which is more than one can usually say. In the interests of the rather tight time schedule this afternoon, I shall ask you just one question, and it will be a short one. Right from the beginning of your thesis, you present a view of Christian theology in which, as you put it, women are in a double bind. That's right at the beginning. They, as you go on to say, are destined to suffer, whether or not they are sinful. This idea runs as a leitmotif throughout your thesis, and I have no problem with that. But during the course of your thesis, you present a number of quite clear instances in which this destiny is resisted in poems in the corpus you've chosen, and, at least to some extent, even overcome by means of the use of a variety of strategies. So my question is this. It's some time since you finished this work. Looking back on your thesis now, can you just give one example of what, in your opinion, is either the most interesting or ingenious of these strategies? One example will suffice, and I should be curious to hear what, in your view, this is. And here is an important caveat. There is no right or wrong answer to this question. There is perhaps an interesting and a less interesting one, but that's all I shall say.
今のポイントがちょっと分からなかったけど。うんうん。
どういうふうに思うかと。
ランドンのストラテジーです。
Would you like Dr. Todd to repeat part of his question to
Yes,
summarize?
I understood most of your question, but
the actual question,
Yes.
looking back on your thesis now, can you give me one example, just one example, of what, in your opinion, is either the most interesting or ingenious of these strategies of resistance or opposition? And one example will suffice, just one.
Strategies used by the poet.
Strategies by the poet.
Who herald the opponents? Thank you for your question. I'm trying to think one instance of London's strategy about strategy of resistance.
Yeah,
okay.
Fine, that's fine. If you could just expand on that, I'm really happy.
So I have made many discussions about this resistance, and one thing I found most interesting is that London's use of layered meanings that was made possible by the genre of the dramatic monologue. So when, as I repeatedly say in this dissertation, she made much of the genre of the dramatic monologue. And by using this style or genre of poetry, it is made possible for her to incorporate different perspectives. So she, for instance, she present one speaker, but then it was the speaker was changed to another speaker. So she made this kind of technique. She uses this kind of technique, and by using this technique, for instance, the first speaker may appear to comply with what is thought to be stereotype of womanhood, but then when the next speaker comes in, then she serves as an objection to this kind of thinking. So by this way, she can insert different perspectives, and it all makes the audience poem wonder what she really means. So I think this is Landa's strategy. What I mean by saying this is that she makes her readers to think about the woman's issues themselves. So I think this way is not a straightforward way to resist, but I think this is what London does in her poetry.
Thank you. No, that's a very interesting point. I think the dramatic monologue is one of the most powerful forms in, and it comes into its own in 19th century poetry. I mean, the canonic person is Robert Browning.
Right, yes.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Todd. The discussion will now be continued, Madam Candidate, by Professor Liebrechts.
Thank you, Mr. Victor. Madam Candidate, first of all, my congratulations on the completion of your dissertation, which is very readable and jargon-free, which I find a great relief, actually. My question focuses on chapter 2 of your dissertation, recasting the legend of Sappho, pages 49 and 50. And there you refer to a book by Elizabeth Bronfen over her dead body. And I have two very closely related questions in this regard. First of all, you show that Bronfen points out, and you quote her on page 49.
49.
Page 49, yes.
49. Okay.
The theme of a woman's death can entail an unconscious desire by men to overcome fear of death, and by watching the death of a woman as other, a man feels that he's different from her and has the illusion of his own immortality. Well, my two questions are actually, you don't show whether you agree or disagree with this statement, and I would like you to comment actually on the fact that this may be a rather one-sided, gendered view. That's my first question. And my second question, related to this, what I miss in this context is the possibility that the description of a woman's death may also be a means of immortalizing her by means of art. I'd like you to comment on this possibility as well.
Hello, the opponents. Thank you for your valuable comments, and also thank you for your two questions. About first question, I think I should admit that I'm only writing about women's poetry, and I had not I'm not discussing any poems by, for instance, Robert Browning and Alfred Tennyson or other male writers. So in this sense, I think I should admit that I'm not thinking about the male poets' strategies and so forth. So I think in the future, I think because the theme of women's death is very wide-ranging and so very much interesting. So what I hope to do in the future is to think about poetry written by male poets which is dealing with women's death. You can find so very many poems of this kind. So that is one thing I have in mind at this moment. And for your second question about immortalization, the possibility of women's immortalization by depicting her death, I think it is of course possible. And I hope I have written in this dissertation that there are so many different significance is possible when you write or read poetry about women's death. So I'm of course certain that the depiction of women's immortalization is possible. But at the same time, what I wanted to focus on in this dissertation is that there is always a danger for both male or female poets to fall into a situation in which women appear to be immortalized, but at the same time she is actually confined in a certain state. So what I really wanted to focus on is this possibility. So I focused on that point, and I continued discussing this point. That is what I hope I did in this dissertation. So.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Liebrecht. The next speaker to take the floor, Madam Candidate, is Dr. Barfoot.
Mevrouw de kandidaat, you are to be congratulated on your concentration on an area of poetry that, rightly or wrongly, is much neglected. I'm referring, of course, particularly to Letitia Lambden, or LEL, and Felicia Hemans. These two are interesting poets with whom students, I think, of English should be acquainted if they're not necessarily expected to study them. But there are also clearly two major English women poets in the 19th century. Christina Rossetti, whom I believe is actually one of the greatest of 19th century poets, irrespective of gender or even of language, and Elizabeth Barrett Browning. And this is really where I come to my question. Quite rightly, you devote a third of your thesis to Christina Rossetti, but I'm surprised that Elizabeth Barrett Browning, whom you refer to and discuss in a couple of pages, 17 and 18 if you want to look at them, isn't made one of the central figures of the dissertation as a whole. In other words, why did you not have 4 poets instead of 3 in the title of your work? Surely Aurora Leigh, which I'm sure you're familiar with and you refer to again in a footnote on page 20, surely Aurora Leigh could be regarded as a first-person dramatic narrative, and it could have fitted into your thesis.
Zero Herelde opponents, thank you for your comments and question. I think I fully understand your point. I also, at the start of the project, I thought of the possibility to discuss Elizabeth Barrett Browning's poetry as well. So I had been thinking about that, but at some point I decided that maybe I will be discussing her poetry in another project, in another article or so. The reason is that as I write in the first, in the beginning of this dissertation, I was focused on those poems by women, which portray women suffering from unrequited love. So all these, London Hemans, Christina Rossetti, all these poets focused on the kind of poetry in which women suffer from unrequited love and complain about their situation, and their love would never have happy endings. But in the case of Elizabeth Barrett Browning, in the case of Aurora Lee, of course, the heroine has a lot of difficulties in the course of the long narrative time, but at the end she is united with her old friend, her cousin. So in this sense, it is not poetry with unhappy ending. And also, I think about a sonnet sequence entitled Sonnets from the Portuguese. That was also published in the middle of the 19th century. This sequence, in this sequence, Elizabeth Barrett Browning is said to have written her feelings for her husband, Robert. And this sequence describes a lot of happy feelings that she had.
So she's too happy.
You
have to be an unhappy woman to qualify for your thesis.
Well, yes. Honestly speaking, when I was reading Elizabeth Barrett Browning's the sonnets from the Portuguese, I was really surprised because those sonnets gives you so very much happy feelings. So I thought, well, what a difference between her sequence, her sonnet sequence.
And of course, she might then she might have offered you as an alternative, which might have actually given a certain amount of extra. No, I'm not going to say life or energy, but it might have been a useful contrast.
It would have been appropriate if I had such a short chapter into this dissertation. So that I really thank you for your valuable advice.
Thank you very much, Madam Candidate. Thank you, Dr. Barfoot. It's my pleasure to give the floor now to Mrs. Dr. Tinkler Villani.
Madam Candidate, I add my congratulations to those of my predecessors for a very well-balanced, very valid argument in your dissertation. But although your arguments are usually very valid and, as I say, well-balanced, in some parts of your dissertation you focus so much on feminist readings of the poems, although thankfully without the jargon, that you seem to ignore some more historical readings which could also have been very fruitful for you. I'll give you two very small examples. Page 55. In the middle of page 55, you discuss a very interesting seesaw game of dominance between two characters. But in the middle of the page, you say that Lorenzo, just before the quotation, in turn starts to control the improvisatrice psychologically. Now, you're quite correct in saying that because you add the word psychologically. Actually, physically, if you read the quotation, we read, I saw a youth beside me kneel. Now, although in language you might be quite correct, Lorenzo is psychologically dominant, but maybe in 19th century terms, a youth on his knees is not very dominant. Perhaps you could have considered both points of view, the psychological point of view, but also the perhaps more obvious physical position. Now, if you move to page 54, just before, you interpret the last line as breathing it, on the quotation, as breathing it, the name, made it mine own, as meaning, as you say just before the quotation, that the improvisatrice is hoping to own his name. And that might be true. It might mean that she wants to take control over it. But on the other hand, it could also mean taking it as her own name, like married women did in the 19th century. And if she was just taking that name as her name, as a married woman, that would actually mean more that she becomes the possession of the man who owns the name. So the language could suggest that she's taking control. But the 19th century sense of that sentence could mean that she's submitting. Throughout the thesis, you discuss the figure of the improvisatrice, not just at this point. So my question is, do you think that your focus on a feminist reading has led you a little bit astray now and then? You could have focused on the figure of the improvisatrice that could have enabled you to look at many more aspects. Could you tell me something about this issue?
Hello, the opponents. Thank you for your comments and question. If I understand your question correctly, you are asking me if I had ever tried to incorporate historical or cultural points of view into my discussion of each poem. Well, I rather concentrated on close reading of each poem. So I may at times appear to leave out any possibilities of that may come from historical points of views. So I think I should admit it. But I try to, but at least I try to incorporate, for instance, what the word improvisatrice meant to people at this period. So I try to find out what the improvisatrice was. It actually, the word actually comes from Italy, where around this time, in the early 19th century, poets or performers called improvisatrice in the case of female poets, and improvisator in the case of male poets were really active, and they were performing in public, and they created a kind of sensation among the public. So I think by incorporating this kind of historical or cultural background, I tried to show that the fact that London used the image figure of improvisatrice was actually rather sensational for the British public. So maybe what I did was not enough, but at least I tried to incorporate some.
I think these various aspects that you discuss in your thesis can be put together into a very interesting next piece of work. Thank you.
Thank you so very much.
Thank you for this kind suggestion. The discussion will now be continued, Madam Candidate, by Dr. van Leeuwen.
Madam Candidate, I really enjoyed reading your thesis. It's very clearly argued, and from the first to the last page, I had an idea that I knew exactly what you were arguing, and for 99% I also agreed with you, your argument. Actually, about a quarter of the way into your thesis, I started noticing this theme of dying women, and I'm a big fan of Edgar Allan Poe, so I was waiting for the page on which you were going to say, and then of course there was Edgar Allan Poe who had this theory about dying women, and how that was the most beautiful subject for poetry. And of course, I wasn't disappointed. There it is, page 49. It's already been mentioned. There he is. So I was very happy to read that you, in that sense, engaged with Poe's theory, an often misunderstood theory from my perspective. He's often been classed as a misogynist, the man who gloated over dying women as the most beautiful subject in the world. But following on from the discussion, he, like the women poets you were discussing, was a very unhappy man. And I was wondering, to what extent Edgar Allan Poe was an author and a poet, of course, as well. He considered himself primarily a poet. He wrote a lot of popular stories, but he felt he really was, at his heart, a poet. And became a reasonably popular poet in his own day. Maybe even more so in England than in America. But to what extent can you tell me whether Poe, not only in hitting on this topic as the theme for poetry, but also in his own, I guess, very, very unhappy and hard struggle in his life, whether you can actually consider Poe to belong to this body of, I guess, female poets or feminist poets who actually try, as you say, to react critically or to express criticism towards the dominant, I guess, gender ideology at the time that put women, in the way you describe it in your thesis, in a very, very narrow kind of pigeonhole. And I wonder, what I would like to hear from you is, to what extent has Edgar Allan Poe, or in his theory, in his poetry, of course I don't know exactly how much Poe you're familiar with, but whether you think he should actually belong in the same category, along with Hemans and Landon, as someone who in his own way, as a man, but still as a man, had a feminist agenda in his work?
Hello, the opponents. Thank you for your very interesting and valuable comments. Well, I think I'm a fan of Edgar Allan Poe. But
That's the right answer.
However, I had never thought about the issue as to whether he was a feminist or not. So I have been a fan of his short stories.
Lots of dying women in his short stories.
But I simply enjoyed reading them. I never thought about feminist issues. But also it might be a very interesting topic to consider. And of course, talking about Edgar Allan Poe's poems, which portray dying women or death of women, he wrote a series of poems about dying women.
Yes, they're almost all about him, yes.
And so one of his those poems is entitled "You Lady," and this name is the same as the heroine in Landon's poem that I discussed, entitled "The History of the Liar." So I was wondering if he had ever read Landon's particular poem.
I think he did. He was a big fan of Elizabeth Barrett Browning. He considered her the best poet who ever lived.
That I didn't know, so thank you for letting me.
The whole meter of the Raven is stolen from a Barrett Browning poem. Yes, he in that sense, he was a great admirer of female poets.
Obviously, it's clear where this thesis must be expanded to. Poe and Barrett Browning. And she, of course, was a dying woman.
Thank you for your interventions, and I suggest that the discussion be continued now by the intervention of Dr. Newton.
It's me. Madam Candidate, as the person who comes last, I was kind of invited to play the role of devil's advocate. It sounds very scary. But before I do so, I guess a word of praise, then a little anecdote, and then the anecdote will flow into the question. The word of praise is, I just enjoyed your thesis very much. I found it very illuminating and interesting, particularly about Christina Rossetti, of whom I'm a great fan, and it was an enjoyable, readable, pleasurable piece of work, and thank you. The anecdote is, it's really, I want to ask you about Felicia Hemans. And the first time I encountered Felicia Hemans was at a seminar given by Isabel Armstrong, who I think you mentioned in your thesis. And at this seminar, Isabel Armstrong gave a brilliant critical reading of a Hemans poem. I remember thinking, this is a brilliant piece of criticism about a very boring poem. And the Hemans, the piece of work seemed very drab and dull, conventional, uninteresting. What was interesting was Isabel Armstrong's criticism. I remember thinking, she's not talking about a tradition of women's poetry, she is part of a tradition of women's criticism. And the criticism really is unconventional, lively, vibrant, exciting, radical. And the poetry itself is rather drab. And I'm afraid to say, I was reminded, in a way this is complimentary, I was reminded of that moment in reading your thesis where I felt the criticism is very exciting, but when it comes to the Hemans in particular, the material you're working with seemed less interesting. I mean, this is into the question which I shall read out. There are various moments in your thesis where I got intimations of how boring Hemans is. The other place I've encountered her is this famous poem, The Boy Stood on the Burning Deck, a kind of traditional patriotic poem that schoolboys like myself were forced to learn in the 1970s. And the feeling you get in reading between the lines of your thesis is that she's quite a conventional bourgeois Christian writer who you want to transform into a radical, subversive figure. And I wondered if in the process of doing so, in a way this picks up Dr. Tinkler's question, are we denying Hemans herself? Would a better reading be one which is more historical and really picked up Hemans' interests? Is there an element in your thesis, and not only in your thesis, but in lots of other people writing about Hemans, of wanting her to be an unconventional, subversive, transgressive figure that she really is not?
Hello, the opponents. Thank you for your comments and question. I truly think this is a very interesting point to make. I think that many researchers have been wondering if Hemans is really conventional and not really interesting, or she is truly a subversive woman poet. And I am also the one who have been asking the same question to me over and over again. And to answer clearly yes or no is very, very difficult for me at this moment.
Yes.
And but I can at least say that she has certainly she has some elements where she can be called subversive. That's, I think, for sure, especially in the poem entitled Arabella Stewart. She incorporates a severe criticism of her husband and in an indirect way male society in general, including her husband. So I think Arabella Stewart is one of her very complicated and very interesting poems, where in which I find her writing very, very much interesting and so exciting.
May I come back though? And, I don't know what probably the Beatles are about to knock on the door, but there's an assumption in what you're saying that to be subversive is to be interesting. And what I was wondering if we read her more historically, could we find an interest in her conservatism, in her Christianity, in her... And when you do with Rossetti, who's perhaps a much more obviously self-divided and conflicted figure, but is it possible to read Hemans that we could read her in a conservative spirit and find her interesting in that spirit? It's not just her subversiveness that makes it interesting. I'm playing devil's advocate. Is that possible?
Yes, I agree with the idea that to be subversive is not always the same with to be interesting.
Yeah.
But what I mean by saying that something is interesting is that maybe this is my tendency, but when I find something, when I find ambiguities in text of poetry, then I find it very interesting because it makes you think and makes you feel like reading into something more. So then I feel that something is interesting.
Yes, good answer.
Thank you. In that case, we have still some time left, and I suggest that Professor Ingelbeen takes the floor once again, if he wants to.
My question sort of follows up from the last question that was asked.
Madam Candidate, the time allowed for the discussion of your dissertation and its propositions has now passed. The committee will now retire for its deliberation. You and your company are requested to await our return and second coming.
Very difficult.
It was difficult for me to understand what they said. Pronunciation was often very strange.
Everybody's pronunciation is very diverse.
Yes.
Kind of identify something.
Somehow this Englishman, I didn't catch his name in the last question, even though he's a native speaker of English, but I spoke very quickly. Hard to follow. You did very, very well. Always remember to say, so people appreciate it, and they can see.
But I have a fear that I may have said Zerhevelde or something to them. Doesn't matter. Okay. I didn't
Absolutely doesn't matter.
because they were, taking off their cap.
Yes.
And I was expecting them to, keep wearing their cap if they are listeners. So I still.
Which one is Dr. Dahan?
Dr. Dahan here.
This one.
Yes. He winked before the session started. I really say that made me relax.
Yeah, good. Many people are trying to help you relax.
Yes, they have been very
Making some jokes.
It's very kind.
Most of them. Ah, very good, very good. You survived.
うまくやってたと思います。いや、
For the second question, I was at a loss how to answer. I
the second
don't
speaker
know.
was pronunciation so different from the first one.
It's very difficult to understand what he was saying.
The
Yes,
first
it's a good question. Somehow, even when he repeated the missing part, he didn't repeat. The part that I didn't understand, he didn't. Say again. I still don't know what. Very good.
これ結構いいと思います。
Excellent. That's very good.
Madam Candidate, we have examined your dissertation and its propositions. We have heard your defense, and we have taken note of the faculty's report on your previous examinations. In consideration of all this, we have decided to confer upon you the doctorate. Professor Daan is authorized to bestow this title upon you, provided he does so in the customary manner.
Meneer de rector, I gladly accept the task assigned to me by the rector magnificus. Uit kracht dan van de bevoegdheid ons bij wet toegekend, volgens het besluit van de commissie hier tegenwoordig, verklaar ik bij deze u, Tomoko Takaguchi, te bevorderen tot doctor. Een bewijzen hiervan zal u het diploma door rector, secretaris en promotor ondertekend en met het grootzegel der universiteit bevestigd ter hand worden gesteld. I ask the secretary to hand you the diploma of doctor. Having thus completed the task assigned to me, I have the privilege of being the first to be able to address you as doctor and to congratulate you on achieving this honor. Zeer geleerde dokter Takaguchi, dear Tomoko, we've come at the end of a very long road, which started somewhere, if I remember correctly, in 1998 or 1999, when actually your husband, Julito here, was doing research with one of the members of our jury, research in linguistics in Leiden. And since I think at the time you had nothing better to do, you thought this would be a useful occasion to try and pursue also your studies in English literature. And you came to me because I at the time was the chair professor here. And after various versions of what you wanted to do, discussions, etc., and various versions of your dissertation, advised amongst other people by Drs. Barfoot and Dr. Tinkler-Villani, who were present here in the jury, and a little bit also by myself, we arrived at the final version, I think also with the active help of one of your secondants here. During our conversations, I was always struck by two things. One, and I think you showed the same characteristics in your defense, you were always very respectful, deferential even, to me and to the other people on your committee, and at the same time you always stuck to your guns. You know? And I think you did so very diplomatically. Talking about strategies of resistance, that was certainly one that worked. From the very beginning, you were very determined to deal with female poets, 19th century female poets, to put a feminist interpretation upon them, and you were also interested in the role of religion in the poetry in question. I think you very handily and sagely combined all these three in what you finally came up with. As we heard during your defense, you paid attention to the figure of the improvisatrice, to women as victims, even as resisting victims, and also how traditions of thematics and imagery descended through generations of women poets, and how all this then came together in the works of, respectively, Felicia Hemans, Letitia Landon, and Christina Rossetti. Now, with your research and with the resulting dissertation, I think, and I think the jury will concur with me in this, that you've actively and usefully contributed to our knowledge of 19th century English literature. And therefore it's completely justified that this university has awarded you a PhD, with which I congratulate you, but at the same time also your husband and your secondant. And that concludes the laudatio.
Thank you very much. Most learned doctor, on behalf of the university, I am happy to congratulate you on the honor which has been bestowed on you today. This ceremony is hereby concluded.
Go ahead.